Dwarven strongholds, giants' keeps, and infernal workshops are just a few locations in your RPG worlds where your players are likely to encounter a forge and want to explore it. And in this sermon, I'm going to help you game masters be prepared to make that experience fun and exciting by showing off a bunch of forge-themed terrain that I have prepped for my own campaigns, and more importantly, I'm going to show you how you can use each piece of terrain to foster some combat roleplay and exploration encounters that your players will have a lot of fun going through, because this is the Church of Doom, and I am your RPG prophet, Landon Gus. So welcome, brothers and sisters. Real quick before we begin, you're going to see some imps making their way down the aisles to collect tithings. Feel free to drop a like or a $3 a month tithing into that to become a patron of the church, in which case you'll be able to download all of the terrain assets you'll see in this video at the link in the description. That's the best way to help me keep doing what I'm doing. So with all of that out of the way, let us pray. Let's start with the most classic piece of terrain in a forge, right? Your forge dungeon has a promethium-fueled forge to heat holy metals. What are some ways you could use that? Well, obviously your players can use it to try and craft some magical weapons or armor, but instead of it having just be a thing where they walk in and like, oh look, I found a finished magical sword, think about a dungeon which has been abandoned, probably hastily so, right? And so there are half-finished pieces of armor and weapons that the players can then attempt to reignite the forge and finish them. Especially this might be possible if one of the characters has proficiencies in Smithy's tools, maybe give them advantage on the checks or lower that DC. But if they're able to get the forge relit and work these metals, then give them some options on what they can make. I would have them maybe even roll a d6 to see how much of this magical metal do they have to work with. And if they roll kind of low, then maybe give them a decision. Like, yeah, you have enough to make 2 magic swords, like 2+1 short swords, or a +1 shield. Ooh, now they have a decision to make and they can talk amongst themselves, which gives you, the GM, a little time to start prepping ahead for the next stage of this encounter or this skill challenge, right? Now, if the challenge is successful, great. They make whatever it is they want to make and they can move on. But if it fails, then that leads us to idea number 2. Your dungeon forges can be a cause of explosions or heating up the forge to dangerous temperatures. If part of this skill challenge involves reigniting these ancient magical forges who have strange sources of fuel, then it's likely that on a failure, these characters might just not know how to handle these dials or, the incantations to stop it from heating up, and it can begin to bake the characters inside like an oven. Or if you do what I like to do, which is merge science and fantasy, right, a science fantasy type of D&D world, then you could literally have these sort of big fuel tanks that could explode in a fireball as the pressure inside builds to up too high. Or if there's a combat going on, right, forget the skill challenge part, if there's just a fight happening in a forge and something punctures one of these fuel tanks, you've got a fireball right there in that area, and that can be a hazard to the players, or it can be something they use to their advantage in a fight to lure enemies towards the forge and then boom, detonate it. Another idea for how you can use your forges is they can reveal lore about the smithies who use them or these forging guilds. What if instead of just your typical chimney with some coals and a fire billowing out of it, there is etchwork into this forge that reveals that when it is lit, there is actually a tiny portal, the tiniest crack formed in the mortal realm that goes to the plane of fire or the 9 hells, and that is what causes the fire to be magical and what allows the smithies of old to create these powerful weapons. And that also can then lead into your descriptions of what happens when things go wrong. When the forge isn't properly handled and it explodes or begins to heat up, this tear in reality gets bigger and bigger and can allow, kind of going down to my next idea here, fire elementals or lesser demons to start clawing their way up out of the forge. That would be so fun as a consequence to a failed skill challenge of not only do you not get that +1 sword that you were hoping to make here, but now you have to fight this horde of lemurs that are dragging themselves out, bubbling like tar and all sickly from coming up out of this forge. Oh man, that'd be awesome. Terrain piece number 2, your forge dungeons will have an indestructible anvil to work holy metals upon, and you could use this to allow your characters to repair or enchant items. If you run a campaign where resources can be given and taken away, right? A crit from an enemy reduces the armor's AC by 1. Characters can sacrifice a shield to ignore some damage. Nat 1 with an attack with a weapon causes it to shatter, right? Whenever they find a forge and an anvil there, they can use that to repair it and get some of those resources back without needing to spend their gold. You could also have it be a sort of combat mechanic where hitting the top of this anvil in a certain pattern, some sort of dwarven glyph might be etched into the top of it, and if you can ping these certain spots, it releases these waves of arcane magics that could deafen creatures. It could release a thunder wave spell, and these are things that your characters can use to their advantage, or if they're trying to get into a Dwargar forge, then these evil dwarves are hitting the top of these anvils and driving the characters maybe mad even. It could start with deafening and then render them unconscious as they're just overwhelmed with the pinging of metal. Maybe they are used to activate secret doors or puzzles. I ran a dungeon once where characters had to hit the top of this anvil in a repeated pattern each round with a skill check to raise sections of this bridge to cross a river of lava. And as the characters were beginning to cross it, some kobolds attacked, and now the character who's playing this anvil, if they get hit or anything, or if they stop playing it, then there's a chance that those podiums are going to start lowering back down into the lava while characters are still crossing it. So you can make for some very perilous puzzles with your anvils. Or you could just use them to open up secret rooms and things, like maybe hitting the top of it in a certain way will cause it to sink into the ground and cause a counterweight mechanism to lift up a door into the vaults where the magical armor and weapons are stored. Or maybe members of a Smithy's guild store their personal stash of gold coins under their anvils because they know these things are so heavy that it's very likely anyone is going to even bother looking under them, let alone actually attempt to lift the thing up and scoop the gold out from underneath it. I'm thinking of that scene in Breaking Bad with the ATM machine where they're trying to break into it and then it falls back and crushes the person underneath it. Maybe you do something similar with your anvils. Your forge dungeons will have sturdy work tables that the smithies could perform their research or finishing fine, intricate details upon their work with, right? And so when your characters find these, this could be a place for them to discover some smithies tools or some tinkerer's tools. If you got a character who's proficient in that, but they've never really used it in the campaign, here's a great opportunity for you to remind them, hey, not only are you actually proficient with this, but there's some pretty fancy sets of tools here that you could use. And I like to use these opportunities where characters find little non-magical items to give them some world-building life. Put a fun description on it. It's not just a set of tinkerer's tools. Each piece has been decorated with a unique animal's head at the top of it. Maybe it's a set of tinkerer's tools or a smithing's tools that was used by a ranger who had different forge stations kind of hidden out in the forest. So the top of some of their etching pins have like an elk head on it. One has a bear head, one has a boar head, right? That little detail is what's going to get the character to hook onto this piece of equipment and really want to use it and make it their own and feel like it adds flavor to their character. It's not just like, it's just a thing I'm going to throw in my inventory and never think about again, right? Maybe at these workstations, though, your characters can also find artifacts or blueprints to help them complete the forging process of magical items that they might have brought here as part of your campaign, right? They had to come here in hopes of being able to finish forging the Rod of Seven Parts, and hidden amongst these primordial workstations that are the size of giants, they're like having to climb up on top of them and pull open these drawers that they can step down inside of, right? They find blueprints to help them finish this work. Or if they find the unfinished +2 sword in the forge, that's great. Maybe between the wizard and the character who's proficient with Smithy's tools, they might be able to finish that. But if they take the time to properly investigate the dungeon and they find these blueprints, the DC is way lower, they get advantage on the checks, and their odds of success just go way up, right? Maybe it's a place where your characters can do some decorative work on their armor or their weapons. This would be an opportunity that I would just allow each character to just tell me, hey, what's something cool you want to do to your armor? If someone is like a coastal character, they have a history or a backstory involving the sea, maybe they etch fish scale patterns into their breastplate. If you've got a fighter who worships the god of storms, well, great, now they can etch a lightning bolt pattern up the length of their sword, right? Give your characters these opportunities to further their lore, further their appearance in the world, make alterations, make changes, start to look like they're actually progressing in level, right? Last idea I had for how you could use a workbench in a forge is that it could be a place to commune with smithies, and that could be in person. Maybe it's not as abandoned as the characters thought, and some old decrepit dwarven smithy comes out and can kind of walk them through their process and tell them about the history of this guild or the history of this dwarven kingdom and how things have been built on this table for generations, right? This workbench is one of the characters kind of is messing around with it, opening a drawer, and the drawer's like, hey, that thing is older than your ancestors, right? Show it the respect it deserves. Or it could be a place where your characters find journals or diaries of these smithies, and they can learn of the things that they were aspiring to build, the things that they had created. They can learn about the most powerful weapons of this region's history came from this forge. Your forge dungeons might have a mana-fueled rack to store enchanted weapons. When your characters explore a forge, they kind of expect, and I've already mentioned it in several of these ideas, magical weapons. And you can make these more interesting than just some sort of wooden rack where they just pull up a +2 sword from, right? Maybe and you can see I've kind of added it into my assets here, these sort of steampunky, magical looking things on the sides that are clearly pumping energies through this rack, right? Maybe the weapons have to be left within it and they're sort of powered up by the mana that is moving through this. And you could give your characters kind of an interesting opportunity here to say, hey, if you leave a weapon in this rack for 1d6 days or something, then when you return and pick it up, it will be enchanted. It'll have that +1 bonus to it. And so in my campaign, I'm thinking of doing exactly that because my world is a huge mega dungeon. So the characters might encounter this forge shrine and know like, well, we're going to go a little deeper. We're going to go off this offshoot, but eventually we're going to be coming back this way. So yeah, we might as well leave some of our preferred weapons here and go fight with kind of weapons that have been in our inventory, but we've never really used, right? Let's use those for a couple sessions, and then when we come back, our favorite weapons will be better than ever. That could be a really cool opportunity or a decision to offer your characters. These could also be a place where you encounter the animated weapons, right? Very common enemy in all kinds of dungeons, but especially a forge. So maybe when your characters enter and they press on that pressure plate trap or they trip the tripwire, whatever they do to trigger the trap, there is a surge of magical energy, sort of maybe magnetic polarizing magics that cause the items to all slide up out of these rack shrines and then attack the characters. That's a cool way to explain to your characters how these items came to be animated instead of just a wizard like casting some sort of spell on them to make them all animated every single time, right? Or it could also be a place where you can imbue items with sentience. Maybe there is something the characters can discover in the etchwork of these shrines or in journals of the blacksmiths at the workbenches, right? The idea we referenced before, that these smithies of this particular forge cared so deeply. They put so much of their own honor and self-worth into these items that each one that was placed within this rack shrine actually took on one of their traits, one of their personalities, or took on an essence, took a part of their essence and imbued it within the weapon. That was the final part of the forging ritual required to make these things magical. The smithy had to be prepared to put some of themselves into it. And now your characters can find some sentient items to have fun conversations with and create relationships with as like just this fun NPC that is always sheathed at their side or, on their back. Their big spear is sentient to a minor degree. It doesn't have to be some crazy powerful magic item that is sentient. It could just be a fun little encounter for your characters to have with a randomly sentient weapon. And the last idea here is that these weapon shrines or these weapon racks can be what are triggered by, I put bio triggers because my world is very science fantasy. So maybe if you don't put your palm upon the scanner tablet and it doesn't read you as one of the blood-sworn smithies of this forge, then that's what will trigger the trap. So you have to go find the corpse of one of the smithies and put its severed hand bone up against this thing to get a proper to lift the hex that's been placed upon these, right? And then you can draw the weapon. Or maybe standing before these shrines, you have to recite a prayer to the god of the forge before you retrieve anything from it. And if you don't do that, then that's what will trigger the trap, or it'll trigger the combat with the animated weapons. Your forge dungeons are, of course, also going to have mana-fueled stands to display enchanted armor. And these are going to do similar things to the weapon racks. They're going to allow them to get enchantments or bonuses. They're going to allow them to become animated, right? The characters walk in and that magic surges up through all of the armors and they kind of stand to attention and attack. Or you could also have it do a couple different things though, like house nightly spirits. If you want to allow your characters to have some role play down in a dungeon, what better way than to have some of these suits of armor have almost holograms, or the spirits of these knights can appear within it. They can't leave. The ghosts are maybe they've sworn themselves to their suits of armor. When a knight fell, in their last breath, they could choose to be sealed within their armor. And now your characters could have a fun interaction with them and learn about the history of this dungeon, learn about their great feats as a hero of the realm. And if they maybe upset this ghost, then the spirit can trigger some sort of trap to try and destroy these intruders or these tomb raiders or whatever they might perceive your party to be, right? Or another idea is that they can be, this one's really cool, they could be a Smithy teleportation pod. What if there was one particular suit of armor in this very ceremoniously looking stand that if you step into it, almost an Iron Man style, right? I imagine as you approach this suit of armor and if you recite a proper prayer, it kind of opens itself up, and then if you step into it and recite the next prayer, right, it closes around you and teleports you to maybe the sister forge of this location. That could be on the other side of the world, or it could just teleport you somewhere else in this forge, a secret chamber that is only accessible by teleportation, right? Just a fun little random idea of how you could use a stand of armor. And the last idea I want to share in today's sermon is that the forge dungeon has a hydraulic press to bend stubborn metals to your will. Some sort of God press. You know, in modern forges, you'll see these hydraulic presses that can slam metal at a much faster rate than any human ever could. So maybe there's something like that in your fantasy forge, and it could be used as the first idea here, some sort of crushing trap or a piece of very deadly terrain. I'm picturing that scene in Star Wars 2 when Anakin and Padme are going through that droid factory, and there's all these giant presses and things going happening all over the place that they're trying to not get caught in. Maybe there's a section of hall in this dwarven forge dungeon that was meant to press pieces of adamantium into the molds of armor, and the characters need to maneuver down this without getting crushed in the process. Or they could use this to maybe fight some sort of really powerful, sort of too high level for them to actually defeat type monster. If they can lure it into the God Press and activate it, then this giant iron golem will get crushed and destroyed, even though the party has no chance of defeating it on their own, right? It could be a really fun, deadly combat idea. You could use this as part of an enchanting ritual. Maybe the characters need to figure out how to use this piece of ancient technology to take that piece of heated adamantium and press it into the forged template for a suit of armor, right? There's not really much you can do with it at an anvil. That wouldn't take weeks or months of time, but the God Press can allow your characters to create some pretty powerful pieces of armor in almost an instant and allow them to use it in the next section of the dungeon, right? It could be a way to sort of fast travel forging if you wanted it to be. Another idea is that you could use the God Press to break open indestructible items. Sort of a random one, but I thought, like, what if your party had gotten like an adamantium box that had something inside? They could hear it rattling, but this box has no seams, no seals. It doesn't have any sort of lock on it. It was clearly made to keep something in it and have it never be found again, or never allow mortals to get their hands on it. But when they find this God Press, they think, maybe if we put it in here and bring this thing down on it at a weird angle, we can pop it open. And what's inside? I don't know. A deck of many things. Something crazy that it's like, hey, as a reward for thinking so out of the box and using this part of the environment in a way it wasn't really meant to be used, here you go. Here's something crazy. Could be a fun way to have some payoff for a thing the characters keep in their inventory for a long time, never really knowing how they're going to get to it. And in a sort of similar vein, I could imagine a God Press or an item like this in a forge being used to seal an iron flask or seal up a genie lamp. If you've got a demon that you've been able to trap within in the iron flask, maybe part of the ritual, if in your campaign, maybe it's not as simple as just like, oh, it's in the iron flask and we seal it and done. No, maybe there needs to be like a cork. Maybe it's not an iron flask, it's like a magical bottle of wine, and the demon is kind of siphoned within it, and then you got to get this thing under the press to press the cork down into the bottle so tight that the demon could never escape. Or the lid of a genie lamp needs to be pressed down with the might and strength of a god to ensure that the genie can't actually escape it. I put that idea on there because I think it could make for a really unique kind of spin on an adventure, and also add some cool lore behind how do things like the iron flask or a genie lamp, how do they actually work? If it's not just some incantation that causes the magic to just do its thing. If you want it to be a little more involved and have it be sort of ritual process, And here's sort of a science fantasy way to do that. Thank you all so much for attending today's RPG sermon. I hope I was able to inspire you to go run a Forge dungeon for your players and introduce some pieces of terrain and allow your characters to interact with them in ways that they might not have before. I encourage you all as well to go follow the church's Patreon. You can do so for free. Every weekday I am releasing the Morning Ritual, just a RPG hobby blog. One of the most recent posts was a list of 1d8 Warlock character ideas. The post that went up today alongside this video was a full list of all of the different terrain pieces I've made for a Forge dungeon. There's probably 4 or so that I didn't mention in this video that you can go read about and see the artwork. And if you are a tithe-giving patron, like I mentioned at the beginning of this sermon, all of that is already available for download, along with 4 pre-populated dungeon maps using that Forge terrain that you can use to run a one-shot or even run your very next session or first session of D&D. But that's it for me today. Thank you all so much for watching, and we say these things in their unholy names. Amen.